First off is, I'm still trying to get my arms around this deficit thing, which has been referenced a couple points throughout the conversation. And I guess the simplest way to put it is, back home, if a family makes $100 and they spend 120, they got a deficit of 20. Vice versa, if they made $100 and they spent 80, they got a surplus of 20, right?
Yes.
So in that regard, is the American public being lied to or just misled with regard to this notion of deficits coming down? And I say that because of this. I actually pulled the numbers. The official deficit of last year was $483 billion.
Yes.
But the debt went up by $1.086 trillion, which is to say there's a difference there of about $600 billion. So when people read in the papers, which they've been reading about, the number coming down, but in fact the debt goes up by about $1 trillion, it doesn't seem to me like the deficit truly coming down. I actually had the office pull the numbers over the last 12 years, and on average there's been about a $279 billion delta per year over the last 12 years on the difference between deficit and, again, debt going up.
So I think there are two factors here, Congressman. One is I believe you're referring to gross federal debt, which includes the holdings of debt, Treasury debt, by certain funds that are also under the control of the federal government. And the measure of debt that we focus on, and I used in my remarks explicitly, was federal debt held by the public, which we think is the better measure.
The number that really matters, that ultimately drives the interest rate on which your long-term assumptions are built,
is federal debt held by the public. It is not the gross debt. It is the debt held by the public. It is the federal government's net transactions.
Wait. You're saying government borrowing from government doesn't matter in impacting interest rates over the long run?
That's right, Congressman. What matters is the federal government's borrowing of funds from the private sector. And so we look at, in our interest rate projections, we look at the amount the government's already borrowed from the public.
Then why not just borrow entirely from other governmental agencies?
Well, Congressman, what we look at is we look at the unified federal budget. So we take all of the pieces of the budget, and this was a concept that was really put in place in the late 1960s, before the foundation of CBO. We focus on the unified budget. So we take all the activities of the government together. And that means that financial transactions within pieces of the government, although we certainly track them and report them in our reports because they are set in place in some cases to be control mechanisms for you, but in terms of the effects of the government and the overall economy, what matters is how the unified government interacts with the private economy.
I understand.
And debt held by the public is the measure.
I would go back, and I only got 2 minutes. It seems to me that the ultimate driver would be aggregate debt in impacting interest rates over the long run, and I think there's a fair amount of history on the economic front that supports that. Secondly, I would say, which is to say, I think that the long-term interest rates numbers are low, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. I also want to take exception, though. You responded to my colleague, Congressman Rokita, with his question, well, you could do revenue or you could do expenses, either one. Your point was either one entirely. I don't think that that's plausible. I mean, the Laffer curve in its entirety is built on the notion of there being a point beyond which you can only squeeze but so much blood from a turnip. If you look at the last 50 years, we've been around 20% fairly consistently. The long-term numbers based on spending are going to take us up 30, 35% of GDP. I don't know how you squeeze that much blood from a turnip based on 50-year numbers that we have historically here in this country.
So, Congressman, if the increase in outlays that we project was met by an increase in revenues of that amount, then revenues would no doubt be a larger share of GDP in this country than they have been historically in this country. But there are other countries that have revenues as a larger share of GDP, and they're making a choice to have more public resources and fewer private resources, and that's a choice that we could make. We don't.
Well,
not our place to recommend for or against.
There aren't cultural differences between civilizations, and I would argue that there are.
As an economic matter, that choice is a choice that the country could make.
So it's premised on a change of mindset within the American psyche that's been in existence for about 50 years, is the choice that you're suggesting could be made.
Well, I think the challenge that you and your colleagues face and that the American people face is that there's a set of benefit programs to which people have become accustomed that are becoming much more expensive because of the aging of the population and rising costs of health care.
So many questions.
So they will need to, we as a people will need to do something very differently than we have become used to on the budget, either revenues or spending programs.
One quick 6 seconds. Erskine Bowles, who was former chief of staff to President Clinton, said that we are looking at the most predictable economic crisis in history, I think it's absolutely clear that the fiscal path we're on is not sustainable, and that the best analogy would be a cancer. Him, again, pointing to this notion of deficits. But I see I've run out of time. A lot of good
Time has
questions I
expired.
can go into, Mr. Chairman.